Welcome to another deep dive, this time into a topic that I think a lot of folks find fascinating and maybe a little daunting too. The whole intersection of homosexuality and religion.
Well, it's definitely one of those areas where you've got all these different threads kind of pulling at each other, right? You've got history, theology, law, personal experience.
Exactly. And you send over some really interesting sources for this one. Encyclopedia entries on a whole bunch of different faiths, some legal discussions, even social science research.
Yeah, I wanted to get a broad perspective,
Yeah, for sure. And that's kind of what we're aiming for in this deep dive, right? To get a sense of how different religions view homosexuality, how those views have changed over time, and what it all means for people who are, trying to figure out how these things fit together in their own lives.
It's definitely a journey for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So to get us started, maybe we could take a step back and look at the historical and legal landscape that's kind of shaped this whole conversation, right?
Sounds good, yeah. I mean, a good place to start might be with Christianity's historical view of sexuality, right? I mean, for centuries, the emphasis was really on procreation. Sex was primarily seen as a means to an end, and that end was children.
Oh, okay, so it was all about having babies.
Pretty much, yeah. And at the same time, you had this parallel idealization of celibacy, especially in those monastic traditions.
Ah, so it sounds like non-procreative sex, whether it's between a man and a woman or between two people of the same sex, it kind of occupy this uneasy middle ground.
Yeah, exactly. You've got this inherent tension within Christian thought, right? I mean, any form of sexual expression that wasn't tied directly to having kids was viewed with suspicion and often just outright condemned.
And that's interesting to think about, right? How that historical context might have influenced the way we understand homosexuality today, even outside of religious circles. I mean, the idea of the homosexual as like a fixed identity, that didn't really come about until the late 19th century, right?
Right. Before that, it was more about acts, not identity. But that shift was crucial because it laid the groundwork for the whole gay rights movement. It allowed folks to start thinking about LGBTQ individuals as a distinct group with shared experiences and deserving of equal rights.
And speaking of rights, the legal landscape around homosexuality it's a wild ride, depending on where you are in the world. In some Muslim-majority countries, being gay can actually get you the death penalty.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of that's tied to the application of Sharia law, which is a complex legal and ethical framework. It's derived from Islamic teachings. Right. But it's important to note that Sharia law isn't monolithic. There are a lot of different interpretations, and how it's implemented varies widely across different countries and cultures.
But in those countries where Sharia law is part of the legal system, the impact on LGBTQ individuals can be really severe. Punishments can range from imprisonment to flogging and, as you said, even death. And that's just such a stark contrast with countries like Canada, where same-sex marriage is not only legal, but mainstream Christian denominations have become increasingly affirming of LGBTQ folks.
Yeah, and Canada's journey towards marriage equality is actually a really interesting example of how legal systems and social attitudes can change over time. The MVH case back in 1999, that was a huge turning point.
That's the one where the Canadian Supreme Court basically said, denying same-sex couples the right to marry, that's unconstitutional.
Exactly. And the court's decision wasn't just based on legal precedent. It also acknowledged that social and cultural understanding of sexual orientation was changing, and it emphasized the importance of equality for all Canadians, regardless of their sexual orientation, and that case had ripple effects. It really prompted similar legal challenges and social reforms all over the world.
So we're starting to see how all these threads are connected, right? History, religion, law, social change, it's all intertwined. Now, maybe we can focus in on some specific religious perspectives, and I guess a good place to start would be the very diverse world of Christianity. It's tempting to think that all Christians hold the same views on homosexuality, but that's just not the case, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, Christianity covers a huge spectrum of theological interpretations and social stances. For instance, the Catholic Church officially opposes same-sex relationships, but it views homosexuality not as a choice, but as a potential disorder.
It's interesting that word disorder, it kind of reflects a particular way of thinking about homosexuality. It's maybe more nuanced than outright condemnation, but it still suggests that something's, I don't know, amiss or needs fixing.
It does, yeah, and that language can be really hurtful for LGBTQ individuals who are trying to find acceptance within their faith, but the Catholic Church also emphasizes the importance of treating everyone with compassion and respect, regardless of their sexual orientation.
Right, right. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have conservative evangelical groups, especially here in the U.S., who tend to have much stricter views.
Yeah, a lot of those groups consider homosexuality to be a lifestyle choice, and they actively oppose LGBTQ civil rights, often citing biblical interpretations that condemn same-sex relationships. And that creates a major point of tension, not just within the Christian community, but in society as a whole, because these beliefs often influence political discourse and policy debates.
It's kind of ironic when you think about biblical interpretations that the King James Bible, one of the most influential translations in history, was commissioned by King James I of England. And if the rumors are true, he was gay himself.
It's true, and it just goes to show how complex history can be, how even people who are deeply embedded in religious contexts might have personal lives that challenge the very doctrines they uphold.
Adds another layer to the whole discussion, doesn't it? And speaking of complexity, the Episcopal Church here in the U.S., they offer a really fascinating glimpse into how these debates play out within a single denomination. They've been ordaining openly gay and lesbian clergy for a while now, but it's caused a lot of friction, a lot of internal divisions.
Yeah, the Episcopal Church's experience really highlights how these theological arguments aren't just abstract debates, they have very real consequences for individuals, communities, and even the structure of religious institutions.
It reminds us that we're not just talking about ideas here. We're talking about people's lives, their faith, their search for belonging.
Yeah.
So, having looked at some of the nuances within Christianity, maybe we should widen our lens a bit and consider how other faith traditions approach the question of homosexuality.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you start to think about how social and cultural contexts actually shape religious views on homosexuality, for instance, in some Asian countries. Christian churches are becoming a lot more affirming of LGBTQ
Oh,
individuals.
interesting.
And a lot of that is because of the influence of, growing social movements for human rights.
Oh, so it's like those cultural shifts are kind of creating a ripple effect, gradually influencing religious thought and practice.
Exactly. Religion doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's always interacting with, the social and cultural forces around it.
Right, right. Okay, so let's get into some specifics. When we look at Islam, the picture gets really complicated, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
you have the Quran, which very clearly condemns same-sex acts.
Yeah, that's true. And in a lot of Muslim majority countries, those verses are interpreted very literally, leading to, the harsh punishments we talked about earlier. But then you also have this long history of homoerotic themes in Islamic literature and
Oh,
poetry.
well,
Yeah, which suggests that maybe there was a more nuanced understanding of sexuality, at least in certain times and places.
Yeah, it's like this tension between official doctrine and the actual lived experiences of people throughout history.
Exactly. And it's something that scholars are still trying to figure out. Some argue that these homoerotic expressions reflect a more tolerant attitude towards same-sex desire that existed in some Islamic cultures before the modern era, but others say, no, 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 these texts are allegorical or symbolic. They're not meant to be taken literally.
So even within a single religious tradition, you can have this huge range of interpretations and practices.
Absolutely. And it's super important to approach these discussions, with sensitivity and an awareness of the historical and cultural contexts that have shaped these different perspectives. For example, when we look at Buddhism, we see a similar kind of complexity.
Right. You mentioned that fascinating bit about the Jataka literature that describes the love between the Buddha and his disciple Ananda.
Right. Some scholars interpret that as homoerotic.
Yeah.
It's a really striking example of how even within a religion that emphasizes detachment and, renouncing worldly desires, there might still be room for more nuanced understanding of human relationships, including those that kind of go beyond those traditional categories.
Yeah, it definitely challenges that assumption that all Eastern religions have always been uniformly accepting of homosexuality.
For sure, it's important not to make sweeping generalizations about entire faith traditions. Each one has its own internal diversity, its own historical evolution, its own ongoing struggles with these questions of sexuality and gender.
Speaking of those ongoing struggles, I'm curious about how Sikhism is approaching this topic. From what I understand, it's a relatively new religion, and it really emphasizes family and community.
That's right. Sikhism originated in the Punjab region of India in the 15th century, and it stresses the importance of leading an ethical and moral life, centered around family values and social responsibility.
So how are they navigating the whole issue of homosexuality within that framework?
Well, it's still a conversation in progress. There's no official stance on homosexuality within Sikhism, and interpretations vary quite a bit. Some Sikhs draw parallels to the Christian debate, focusing on the difference between lust and love, arguing that committed same-sex relationships that are based on love and mutual respect those shouldn't be condemned.
So it sounds like there's this sort of emerging dialogue within Sikhism trying to reconcile traditional values with the realities of modern society.
Precisely. And it'll be really interesting to see how this conversation unfolds in the coming years, especially as younger generations of Sikhs, who are often more exposed to diverse views on sexuality, start to make their voices heard.
Yeah, it feels like we're witnessing this global shift in attitudes towards homosexuality, and it's impacting religious communities in some really profound ways.
It really is. And as we kind of delve deeper into this, it's important to also consider how social science research has contributed to our evolving understanding of sexual orientation. I mean, for a long time, homosexuality was viewed through a medical
Oh,
lens.
right, it was seen as a mental illness, like a deviation from the norm.
Exactly. But that perspective has changed so dramatically.
It has. And one of the big turning points in that shift was the decision by the American Psychiatric Association back in 1973 to remove homosexuality from its list of mental disorders.
Right. That decision, which was based on tons of research and clinical observations, really sent shockwaves through the medical community and beyond.
It's pretty amazing to think about how much has changed in just a few decades. What was once considered a pathology is now understood as just a natural variation of human sexuality, and that shift has had such a huge impact on how we view homosexuality, not just within the scientific community, but in society as a whole, including religious circles.
Totally. The scientific validation of homosexuality as a natural orientation really challenged those long-held religious beliefs that condemn same-sex relationships as sinful or unnatural.
It's like the whole foundation of the conversation shifted. All of a sudden, there was this new framework for understanding homosexuality, one that was based on evidence and observation rather than dogma.
Exactly. And for a lot of LGBTQ individuals, that shift was incredibly empowering. It provided a sense of legitimacy and it really affirmed their own lived experiences.
Of course, for LGBTQ folks within religious communities, that shift hasn't necessarily made things easier.
Yeah.
I mean, the coming out process can still be so fraught with challenges, especially when their faith tradition doesn't fully affirm their identity.
Yeah, it can be such a deeply personal and often painful journey, full of internal conflict and, the fear of rejection from loved ones and their faith community.
And it's not just about coming out to family and friends. It's also about coming out to yourself, about reconciling your sexual orientation with your religious beliefs, which can sometimes feel impossible.
Right, and that's where this idea of self-acceptance as a spiritual journey becomes so important. It's about finding a way to embrace your true self, to honor both your faith and your sexuality, even when they seem to be in conflict.
It's about recognizing that those two parts of yourself aren't mutually exclusive, but they can coexist, even complement each other.
Exactly. And for many LGBTQ individuals, that journey of self-acceptance becomes interwoven with their spiritual journey as they try to find a place for themselves within their faith tradition, or maybe even create a new spiritual path that's more inclusive and affirming.
This leads us to the idea of queer spirituality, which I find so interesting. Can you tell us a bit more about what that means?
Sure, queer spirituality is a broad term that encompasses a whole bunch of approaches to faith and spirituality that center the experiences and perspectives of LGBTQ individuals.
So it's not necessarily tied to any one specific religion or denomination?
Nope, not at all. It can manifest within those existing faith traditions as LGBTQ individuals challenge traditional interpretations of scripture and try to find more inclusive understandings.
It's about reclaiming and reinterpreting those traditions, finding new meaning within them.
Exactly. And it can also involve creating entirely new spiritual practices and communities that are explicitly welcoming and affirming of LGBTQ individuals.
It's about creating spaces where people can be their authentic selves without having to compromise their faith or their identity.
Precisely. And this movement towards queer spirituality is so diverse. It encompasses everything from LGBTQ affirming churches to pagan and earth-based spiritualities to individual practices that kind of blend elements of different traditions.
It's a testament to the resilience and creativity of LGBTQ people of faith who are forging these new paths and redefining what it means to be both queer and spiritual.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that the conversation around homosexuality and religion is constantly evolving as individuals and communities continue to wrestle with these really complex issues and try to find new ways to make sense of their faith and their identities.
Yeah, it really is inspiring to see this emergence of queer spirituality. People reclaiming faith on their own terms. And it's fascinating how the conversation has shifted. It's gone from, can LGBTQ people be religious?
Yeah.
To how are LGBTQ people shaping religious thought and practice?
Yeah, it's a huge shift, and it reflects a growing awareness of the lived experiences of LGBTQ people of faith and their contributions to religious communities. We're seeing the rise of these explicitly welcoming and affirming faith communities, like the Metropolitan Community Church we mentioned earlier, which was actually founded by a gay Pentecostal minister.
And even within those, traditional denominations, there are individuals and groups pushing for change, advocating for more inclusive interpretations of Scripture, and challenging those long-held doctrines that have historically been used to exclude LGBTQ
Yes.
individuals.
The Episcopal Church is a perfect example of that internal struggle they've
These aren't just, theoretical debates happening in some ivory tower. They have real consequences for people's lives, their relationships, their sense of belonging within their faith communities.
For sure. And it forces us to really confront some fundamental questions about authority interpretation. Even the very nature of faith itself, like who gets to decide what's right or wrong when it comes to these issues of sexuality and religion? How do we reconcile ancient texts with modern understandings of human identity and experience?
Those are big questions, and there aren't any easy answers, but it feels like the pressure for change is building. Social attitudes towards LGBTQ people are changing so rapidly, especially among younger generations.
Absolutely. And that shift is definitely going to impact religious institutions as more and more LGBTQ people come out and live openly. It's harder for religious communities to just ignore them or dismiss their experiences.
It's like a critical mass is building the voices of LGBTQ people of faith, and their allies are getting louder and they're demanding to be heard.
And it's not just about demanding inclusion. It's about offering new perspectives, new ways of understanding scripture, new ways of being religious.
So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for the relationship between homosexuality and religion?
I mean, that's a question that only time can answer. But if you look at the big picture, it seems pretty clear that the conversation isn't over social attitudes are going to keep evolving and religious institutions are being challenged to adapt.
It's a really exciting and uncertain time, but one thing's for sure, this dialogue is happening, and it's happening all over the world.
And in the end, it's not just about LGBTQ rights or religious doctrines. It's about human dignity, compassion, our ability to love and accept each other even when we're different.
So for our listeners out there who've been with us on this deep dive, what would you say is the most important thing they can take away from all this?
I think the most important takeaway is you're not alone. There are millions of people around the world wrestling with these same questions, navigating the complexities of faith and sexuality. And there are resources out there, communities of support online, offline, and so many stories of resilience, hope, even triumph.
It's a good reminder that even within these seemingly rigid structures, there's always room for growth, for change, for new understandings to emerge.
Exactly. And for those who are struggling, who are feeling lost or conflicted, remember that your journey is valid. Your search for meaning and belonging is worthy.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored history, theology, law, social science, personal experiences. And even though there aren't any easy answers, I hope this exploration is giving you some food for thought, some new perspectives, maybe even a sense of hope.
Remember, this is just the start of the conversation. There's so much more to explore, to question, to learn.
So keep diving, keep questioning, and keep looking for those aha moments. And most importantly, be kind to yourselves and to each other. Until next time.